welcome to English Through Experience. I'm ETE Tutor and this is a quick revision video for any students doing Edexcel GCSE English Language Paper 1 Section A. So if you haven't already seen the videos for questions 1 and 2, I would suggest you check those ones out because the information that we go through there is also helpful for tackling question 3. In this video, we're just going to talk about the question itself, and then there's going to be a separate video with the answer and the ideas that you can come up with. So, the reason I'm doing that is because a lot of people find this the first sort of challenging question. It's a 6-mark question, so obviously worth considerably more than the 2 you've already done. And people get a little bit confused about which features class as language features and which features class as structure. There's also some confusion about the method. Now, some of you might be really confident in terms of the method that you've been using at school or with a private tutor or that you've worked out yourself, and that is absolutely fine. If it's close to the exams, don't go trying to change things up now, but just use my analysis and the information I'm giving to help enhance your answer. If you haven't got a clue and you haven't got a method at all, then I'd suggest you try and work with this one if it's close to your exam. Okay, so you'll always be given a section of text. In the exam, it'll normally be more from lines so-and-so to so-and-so. But here, because we're just practicing, we're looking at paragraph 3. So I've highlighted that part, and I would suggest that in the exam you either highlight the section or draw a box around the section, because if it's not in there, the examiners are unable to give you full marks. And it's heartbreaking, speaking from the point of view as an examiner for AQA, it's horrible when students go outside the area that they're supposed to be working in, because they can write some really excellent points, but we cannot award the marks. You can never get full marks. So that is really important. And then the other thing that's essential here is that within the views you give, within your examples, you need to cover both language and structure. And those points need to be linked to the question focus. So this time it's how, the ways in which the writer uses language, so these could be particular language devices, and structure to highlight the isolation and vulnerability of the narrator. Okay, so take a second, let that sink in. And then we get support your views with reference to the text. Now, it would be impossible to answer this question without doing that. In terms of your references, dependent on the points you're talking about, you'll either use quotations or you could paraphrase, so put things into your own words, and we'll see that more in the second video. But for now, we want to make sure you're clear on what things you can talk about in terms of language and what things you can talk about in terms of structure. Now, the method I'd suggest is that you try to find 3 separate points, and within that covering language and structure. Most people find language a little bit easier, so it could be 2 language points and a structure point, but if not, 2 structure points and a language point. And for each of those points, there has to be the explanation as to how those things are working and how they link to the question focus. So, for language, the things that we're talking about here are the words themselves. That's an easy way to try and think about it. And what you've got to try to do is think about the whole section of the text you're looking at. So here we've got the whole of paragraph 3. And before you get started, it's worth just kind of getting the facts straight in your mind. So, is the piece a first or third person narrator? Is there change within the piece? and then follow the section through, pointing out particular things. So can you see figurative language? Can you see those metaphors, those comparisons, direct comparisons? Can you see similes, those comparisons that use like and as? Is there any personification? So have we got inanimate objects being given human characteristics and personalities? So if you could spot a metaphor, simile or personification, and it relates to the isolation and vulnerability of the narrator in this case, then you would have a point there. You'd be saying something along the lines, the writer uses the simile and then give the simile. This highlights the isolation and vulnerability by, and then giving some kind of explanation. Okay, so that's one thing. We could look out for figurative language. We could also look out for descriptive language. So are there adjectives, adverbs? Is there sensory language? So language that appeals to the five senses within there. And again, you'd structure it in the same way, say what you can see, give your quote, and then link it to the question in a little bit more depth, showing how it works. And then you might want to think about dialogue. Is there that direct speech within the text? And within that dialogue, is there everyday language? So colloquialisms, idioms? Does the writer use cliches? So all of those things will come in under your language analysis. And then when we go to the structural side of things, you are more thinking about sentences. So it could be that you can see that there are simple sentences. Do these stand out for a reason? Are they related to the question focus? Are there compound sentences? Are there those long, complex sentences? And just so you know, because these texts are older, quite often there are long sentences with lots and lots of punctuation, and that's reflective of the era. So that's something that comes up again and again. And then we can also think about the form the sentences take. So are they statements of facts? Are there questions in there? So if there's a lot of questions within a text and this is repeated, that'll be a structural point that you'll be able to comment on. Are there imperative sentences? So sentences that are giving commands. Are there exclamations? So those sentences that are quite dramatic statements, often ending in that exclamation mark. So that's another thing you can think of in terms of structure. Another aspect of structure could relate to pace. So how is the focus of the text changing? Do we get really close description of one particular thing? Is there punctuation that increases the speed at which the reader reads the piece, therefore having an impact on their emotional reaction to it? You could also think about if there are words from a particular semantic field. So, I don't know, the example of semantic field of death is quite an easy one. So if there are lots of words to do with death, you could select those all out, and they don't all have to be together. As long as they're in that paragraph, you could create a list of those words from a particular semantic field and then link them to the question focus. You could do the same with repetition. Repetition's a tricky one because sometimes, depending on the way you describe it, it can be a language point or a structural point. So if it's all within one sentence, it's probably going to be easier to talk about in terms of language. If something is repeated but sort of changed or enhanced throughout the section you're looking at, and it's doing that to build tension, for example, then you'd be able to say it's helping to structure the text. Okay? I hope that all makes sense. Check back in for the next video where we're going to see some of what I've talked about in action with reference to this particular section. But I would suggest now that you have a go at this question. It is only 6 marks, so just spend a little bit of time trying to come up with what answers you would give, remembering what I've said here, using the notes you've made, if you've made some. Have a go at the question now and then check in with the next video and see if I talk about any of the things that you talk about. Alright then, I really hope that's helped. Remember to really focus on what you have learnt at school or learnt in your own studies or college or with your tutor, however you're learning. Focus on what you've already done, but try and use some of the information here to enhance your work. Alright then, best of luck and an extra special good luck to anybody doing those 2018 resits.